The HOA president didn't knock. She arrived like a warning, clipboard in hand, polite smile sharpened like a blade. Her first words? "You'll need to tear down your father's garden." At first I thought it was just another petty neighborhood rule. I had no idea it was the start of a campaign. Letters, fines, threats, meant to strip away the last piece of my father I had left. They called it community standards. I called it war over memory. Before I tell you how it all spiraled, and how I found proof my father left behind that destroyed their authority, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you've ever dealt with an HOA that went too far. Now, let me take you back to the day it all began. I moved back into my childhood home on Maple Hollow Lane 2 months after my father passed. The neighborhood looked the same on the surface: neatly cut lawns, white fences, soft yellow porch lights. But the energy was different. When I was a kid, people here used to wave from their driveways. Now they just nodded like robots programmed for civility. My father had lived in this house long before the HOA existed. Long before the rules about paint color and grass height and approved mailboxes. The first morning I was back, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. It was exactly as I remembered. Wild, bright, messy in all the right ways. Roses climbed the old trellis, lavender spilled over the walkway, and the stone path curved just enough to bother anyone obsessed with symmetry. It smelled like earth and sun and memory. My father used to call it his rebellion that blooms. He'd laugh and say, "Uniformity kills color, kid. Keep some weeds. They remind you you're alive." The neighbors didn't see it that way. The same week I moved in, I caught a few of them slowing their cars as they passed, eyes lingering on the edges where the flowers crossed the fence line. One afternoon, a woman from down the street mentioned, almost kindly, that the HOA prefers neat borders. I thanked her and kept trimming the lavender, enough to look polite, not enough to betray what mattered. The first notice arrived less than a month later. It was a polite warning typed in corporate font and tucked neatly under my door. "Unapproved landscaping modifications. Please submit plans for review." I laughed at first. The garden had existed for decades. My father had planted it before most of these houses were built. I assumed it was a clerical error. Then the second letter came, this time citing multiple non-compliance issues and warning of daily fines. The tone was still polite but colder, as if written by a machine learning how to sound human. I set it aside again. I was still grieving, still trying to make sense of a world without my father in it. Fighting bureaucracy felt exhausting. But grief and pressure mix into something sharp. The HOA's letters kept coming, each one more formal than the last. By the third week, I received a notice claiming my property posed aesthetic disruption. Another warned about potential pest hazards. I'd barely unpacked my boxes, yet somehow my father's roses had become a neighborhood crisis. The HOA president, her name was Barbara, showed up at my door one Saturday morning. She wore a blazer the color of wet cement and carried a clipboard like a badge. She smiled too much and spoke like every sentence had been rehearsed. "We just want to maintain harmony," she said. "Your father's garden doesn't align with the community's standards." I asked her what harmony meant. She gestured vaguely toward the street where every house looked cloned. "Consistency," she said. After she left, I stood in the yard for a long time. The air smelled like cut grass from my neighbor's perfectly trimmed lawn. My father's words came back to me, about control, about how once you let people legislate beauty, they'll start charging fees for breathing too loud. I hadn't understood him then. Now I did. I started going through his old workshop at night, looking for anything that might explain why he'd fought the HOA so hard in its early years. He kept everything. Blueprints, tax receipts, letters to the developer. Buried among them was a file labeled property, not subject to covenant. Inside were photocopies of deeds, handwritten notes, and a signed declaration stating that his parcel was explicitly excluded from any future community association unless voluntarily annexed. At first, I didn't grasp the significance. Then it hit me. My property wasn't under the HOA's control at all. My father had written himself out of their authority decades ago and never told anyone. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. I decided to stay quiet. If they wanted a war, I'd let them make the first public move. In the meantime, I fixed up the garden, I trimmed the hedges, cleared the paths, cleaned the trellis. The more the HOA threatened, the better the garden looked. Maybe part of me wanted to show them that order didn't belong to them. By midsummer, the letters turned into invoices. They fined me for non-approved hardscape elements, then for failure to respond to official correspondence. Each fine increased daily. They were trying to bleed me into submission. Neighbors who used to smile started crossing the street to avoid small talk. A few whispered about the troublemaker on Maple Hollow. Still, I refused to yield. I began documenting everything, taking photographs, logging dates, saving every piece of mail. I even installed a small camera near the fence after catching a board member photographing my backyard. One night, through the lens, I saw two of them pointing at the roses, one shaking his head as if I'd planted a crime scene. The next morning, I printed still frames from the footage and filed them in a binder labeled Evidence. It became my ritual. Coffee, documentation, gardening. I was no longer just maintaining flowers. I was preparing for battle. Then came the official notice. Remove the garden within 30 days or face legal action. They called it a community safety measure. I laughed when I read that. My father's roses had survived droughts and winters. Apparently, they were now a threat to civilization. I knew the fight was about control, not flowers. The HOA needed to prove no one could resist them. And I, apparently, was their test case. I spent nights reading property law, comparing the association's bylaws with state statutes. I found gaps everywhere. Missing signatures, invalid meeting minutes, rules that contradicted themselves. I wasn't a lawyer, but I could smell incompetence through paperwork. Every discovery went into the binder. Then one afternoon, a man in a neon vest appeared in front of my gate with a clipboard. He said he was there for an inspection. I asked under what authority. He pointed to the HOA's name on his work order. I pointed to the private property. No trespassing sign. He hesitated, looked at the camera above the fence, and left. 10 minutes later, an email from the HOA accused me of obstructing compliance. That night, I realized I couldn't just react anymore. I had to take the initiative. I drafted a formal request for all HOA records under the state's homeowner access law. Meeting minutes, votes, budgets, enforcement logs, everything. They were legally required to provide them within 10 business days. I sent the request by certified mail, with copies to their lawyer. When the HOA refused, claiming the records were not available, I added that to my binder too. Every lie was a building block. The following week, a neighborhood newsletter appeared in everyone's mailbox. It mentioned, without names, a resident whose non-compliance threatens community integrity. The accompanying photo, blurred but unmistakably my garden, made it clear who they meant. They had turned me into an example. It worked for a while. The neighbors withdrew. The air around my house grew tense, like static before lightning. I stopped expecting smiles, but what they didn't know was that isolation has its uses. When you have no one left to please, you can focus entirely on the fight. The HOA expected me to crumble. Instead, I grew systematic. I filed complaints with the state's Homeowners Association Oversight Division. I documented every violation of due process. I mapped timelines and cross-referenced emails. The binder became so thick, I had to split it into volumes. When they announced a hearing to address my violations, I treated it like a trial. I brought printed exhibits, the exclusion clause from my deed, the county property map, and photos proving the garden existed long before their bylaws. I didn't raise my voice. I just placed the documents on the table one by one. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They said they would take the matter under advisement. 2 days later, they doubled my fines and warned of a possible lien. That's when I knew it was time to stop waiting for fairness and start demanding it legally. I contacted an attorney for a consultation. Not a big firm litigator, just a local property lawyer named Mendoza who'd spent 20 years dealing with homeowner disputes. He looked through my binder for 10 minutes, whistled low, and said, "They don't have a leg to stand on. You're outside their jurisdiction. You could sue them tomorrow." I wasn't ready to sue yet, but I wanted them to know I could. I sent a final certified letter demanding that they cease enforcement, rescind all fines, and acknowledge my exemption within 5 business days, or I'd seek declaratory judgment. Their response came fast. A threat of a lien and possible legal action for obstruction. I remember standing on the porch that evening, watching the sunset light my father's roses, and realizing this wasn't just about property. It was about dignity, about legacy, about not letting small power win by attrition. So I did what my father would have done. I filed the case myself. The day after I filed the lawsuit, I felt a kind of quiet I hadn't experienced since moving back. Not peace exactly, but clarity. The garden looked the same, the air smelled the same, but everything had shifted. For months, they'd tried to make me react to their pace. Now, the rhythm was mine. That morning, a notice appeared on the HOA's online portal, a new Community Beautification Initiative. It listed stricter standards for lawns, fences, and decorative structures. It didn't name me, but the first example photo was unmistakably my garden. They wanted to bury their embarrassment in new rules, pretending this was about everyone. But neighbors weren't buying it. Word had spread that I'd taken them to court, and whispers about the guy with the garden turned into curiosity instead of avoidance. For the first time in months, someone waved as I walked to the mailbox. Still, the HOA wasn't done. 2 days later, a plain envelope arrived. No return address, just the word notice. Inside was a new fine schedule showing daily non-compliance penalties. They doubled the previous amounts, adding an administrative fee for processing. It was absurd, considering we were already in litigation, but I filed it neatly into my binder anyway. Every overreach was more evidence. I began treating the case like a second job. My mornings were for work, my evenings for research. I spent hours reading statutes, county codes, case histories. The HOA's bylaws were a patchwork of contradictions, full of clauses copied from templates and amended haphazardly over the years. Some of their rules had never even been properly ratified. I found discrepancies in the meeting minutes, votes that didn't meet quorum, notices that had never been sent. I highlighted every violation until the pages looked like confetti. A week later, I received an email from Barbara herself. It was short and smug. "Given your recent filing," she wrote, "the board will no longer communicate directly with you. All correspondence will go through our counsel. We will continue to enforce compliance until this matter is resolved." I stared at the message for a long time. The subtext was obvious. They were trying to drain my energy, force me to give up through exhaustion and cost. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't alone anymore. After I filed the case, Mendoza agreed to take me on formally. His fee wasn't cheap, but he believed in the principle of it. "They've gotten away with this for too long," he said. "Let's make sure they learn." The first hearing date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the HOA escalated their harassment. I'd find anonymous notes on my windshield, comments about keeping standards up, and photos of my property uploaded to the community portal labeled non-compliance citing. It would have been laughable if it weren't so invasive. Then came the security car. It started driving past my house every night, slowly, headlights dimmed, the same SUV, same route, always pausing at my driveway before moving on. The first night, I ignored it. The second night, I started recording. On the third, I emailed the footage to Mendoza. "They're escalating intimidation," I wrote. He replied within minutes. "Keep documenting. Don't engage." So I did. Every photo, every letter, every drive-by went into the binder. My collection of evidence had grown so large, I had to buy a second set of binders just to fit the new material. I numbered each page, cross-referenced them by date, and created an index. It wasn't paranoia. It was armor. By now, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to touch. Some people supported me quietly. Others still treated me like a threat. One morning, as I was pruning roses, a neighbor approached. She was an older woman I barely knew, the kind who never got involved in anything. She looked around nervously and said, "I just wanted to say, good for you. We've all wanted to stand up to them, but nobody ever does." Then she turned and hurried away before anyone could see. That sentence stayed with me. Nobody ever does. 2 weeks before the hearing, Barbara called an emergency HOA meeting. The email invitation said the agenda was community safety concerns. I attended out of curiosity. The clubhouse was packed. The board sat behind their long table, papers stacked neatly, voices sharp with authority. Barbara started by outlining the growing problem of non-compliance. Every sentence was a veiled reference to me. She warned about rogue homeowners undermining order, about legal distractions, wasting resources. When she finally mentioned pending litigation, I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it again. "You're out of order," she said, refusing to look in my direction. The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up quietly to ask what was really going on. I told them the truth. My property wasn't legally part of the HOA, that my father had recorded an exemption decades ago, that everything they were doing was based on false authority. Most were stunned. Some didn't believe it. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That week, the HOA's attorney sent a formal letter threatening to file a lien for unpaid fines. Mendoza fired back with a warning of his own. Any attempt to record a false lien would result in a counterclaim for slander of title and damages. The HOA went silent for a few days after that. Silence, I learned, was never a sign of surrender. Only recalibration. 3 nights later, the security SUV returned. This time, it stopped in front of my house for nearly 5 minutes. I stepped outside and stood on the porch, phone in hand, recording. The driver looked at me, then drove away without a word. I uploaded the footage to a secure drive and emailed it to Mendoza. He told me it would make a strong point about intimidation if the judge asked why I was seeking injunctive relief. By now, the garden had become something larger than a piece of land. It was a battlefield, but also a sanctuary. Every morning I'd walk through it, tracing the same paths my father used to walk, feeling his presence in the rhythm of it all. He'd built this place to be untamed, alive, defiantly imperfect. That imperfection had become my armor. A few days before the hearing, something unexpected happened. A local blogger who covered community issues reached out after hearing rumors of a lawsuit over a garden. I hesitated at first. I wasn't looking for publicity, just justice. But Mendoza advised me to share the story carefully. Truthfully, public eyes keep bullies honest, he said. The article went live the next day. Local homeowner fights HOA over late father's garden. It was short, factual, but the headline struck a nerve. Comments poured in from people across the city, each sharing their own horror stories about HOAs gone too far. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't just a stubborn homeowner anymore. I was the man standing up to a system everyone hated. Barbara hated it, of course. That afternoon, she posted a statement on the HOA website, calling the article misleading and damaging to the community's reputation. Her post only drew more attention. Within hours, half the neighborhood had read it. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I went through every piece of evidence, checked every tab in the binder, memorized every page number. I didn't know what to expect in court, but I knew the truth was on my side, and on paper, it was airtight. The courthouse was smaller than I imagined, the kind of building that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Barbara arrived with 2 other board members and their attorney. I sat across from them, binder open, pen steady in my hand. The judge entered, a calm older man with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too many neighborhood squabbles turn into wars. The HOA's attorney spoke first, painting a picture of me as a defiant homeowner endangering property values. He talked about order, harmony, safety, all the same words they'd used in their letters. He claimed my garden violated community standards and that allowing exceptions would create anarchy. When it was my turn, I didn't try to sound eloquent. I just told the truth. I explained how my father's deed had excluded our property from the HOA before it even existed, how they'd ignored my letters, trespassed, threatened fines, and refused to show records. Then I opened the binder. One by one, I presented the documents: the recorded deed, the exclusion clause, the county map, the photos, the certified mail receipts. I handed the judge a copy of the letter where the HOA's own attorney admitted they were still trying to locate annexation records. Then I showed him the security footage of their inspector stepping onto my property. By the time I was done, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning. The judge asked the HOA's attorney a simple question. Do you have any documentation proving this property was ever annexed into the HOA? The attorney shuffled papers, then admitted, We're in the process of verifying that, Your Honor. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. You're fining someone without confirming jurisdiction? The attorney stammered something about long-standing precedent. The judge raised an eyebrow. Precedent isn't ownership, he said flatly. He granted me a temporary restraining order, preventing the HOA from entering my property or enforcing any fines until jurisdiction could be proven. He gave them 7 days to produce the records. Barbara's face went pale. She nodded mechanically, pretending composure, but her hands trembled as she gathered her papers. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled. A small, quiet release I'd been holding for months. Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors who'd come to watch clapped me on the back. Someone whispered, "About time somebody stood up to them." I drove home with the restraining order sitting on the passenger seat. The neighborhood looked the same, but everything had changed. That night, for the first time since the fight began, I slept through the night. Over the next week, things got messy for the HOA. They scrambled to meet the judge's deadline, producing boxes of old files that only made things worse. In their rush to look legitimate, they handed over internal emails, communications between board members revealing doubts about their authority over my property. One email from Barbara herself read, "I can't find any annexation paperwork for that parcel, but we've always enforced there, so it should hold up." It didn't. When Mendoza read the email, he grinned. "They just gave you your silver bullet." By the time the next hearing approached, the tide had turned completely. The neighborhood knew the truth. The HOA's silence in public only made them look guiltier. People began knocking on my door, asking how they could review their own property records. For the first time, I wasn't alone. Barbara, however, wasn't done. The night before the next hearing, I found a final notice taped to my door. One last desperate attempt to assert power. It declared my garden a continuing nuisance and threatened removal under Community Emergency Authority. I laughed, peeled it off, and tucked it neatly into the binder under retaliation evidence. The following morning, I woke before dawn. The air was cool, still damp with dew. I walked through the garden, touching the leaves, the petals, the soil my father had once worked with his hands. I thought about how something as small as a flower bed had turned into a legal war, and how absurd it all was. But beneath the absurdity was something deeper. The realization that small acts of defiance matter. My father's garden wasn't just flowers. It was proof that control only works when people surrender quietly. When I left for court that morning, I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt ready. Because the truth wasn't fragile. It was written in ink and soil. And that day, I was about to prove it. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, the kind of scent that never really leaves government buildings. When I arrived for the follow-up hearing, Mendoza was already waiting on the bench outside, flipping through a folder so worn it looked like it had been through battle. He nodded when he saw me and said quietly, "Today's the day they stop pretending." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier than before. Word had spread. A few neighbors sat in the back rows, whispering to each other. The HOA board members sat together like a row of mannequins, trying to look composed. Barbara avoided my eyes. Their lawyer carried a box of files that, by the end of the day, would expose more than he wanted. The judge entered, the clerk called the case, and the ritual began. The HOA's attorney started with an apology for missing paperwork, then shifted to the same arguments as before. Tradition, consistency, community standards. He talked about property values, about harmony, about how everyone benefits from shared rules. The judge let him finish before asking, "Do you have the annexation documents now?" The attorney hesitated. "Your Honor, we've located several amendments that reference the subject parcel." The judge interrupted. "Reference is not proof." Then it was our turn. Mendoza handed up copies of the emails the HOA had produced under court order. I watched the judge's expression as he read them. One line stood out even from where I sat. "We've always enforced there, so it should hold up." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Mendoza spoke calmly, the way people do when they know they're holding the last card. He explained that no recorded document ever annexed my parcel, that the HOA had levied fines without jurisdiction, that they had trespassed and threatened illegal liens. He pointed out that they ignored record requests and fabricated enforcement votes without quorum. Then he gestured toward me. "My client isn't seeking damages for pride. He's asking this court to confirm what the law already says. His home and his late father's garden are not, and never have been, under this association's control." The judge asked me if I wanted to add anything. I stood, cleared my throat, and said, "This garden was planted before the HOA existed. It's all I have left of my father. I just wanted to be left in peace." That was all. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. The judge looked down at the papers one last time, then said, "It's clear to the court that the Homeowners Association acted without authority. Jurisdiction over the petitioner's property is not established by record. The fines and enforcement actions are hereby declared void." It was over just like that. No dramatic gavel bang, no shouting, just the quiet certainty of a sentence that ended months of chaos. Barbara's composure cracked. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. The other board members sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or shrink. Their lawyer whispered something to them, but it didn't matter. The judge's order stood. Outside the courtroom, neighbors approached me hesitantly. One of them, a man who'd once reported me for non-compliant lighting, put out his hand and said, "Didn't think you'd actually win." I shook it anyway. "Neither did they," I said. That night I went home, poured a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch looking out at the garden. The air smelled of earth and rain. For the first time in months, there were no letters on the doorstep, no cars slowing to photograph my yard, just the quiet hum of crickets and the memory of my father's laugh echoing in the wind. But the story didn't stop at victory. The court's decision triggered ripples the HOA hadn't anticipated. News of the ruling spread quickly, first through the neighborhood, then through local papers, then online. The headline was simple: "Homeowner wins case against HOA over garden jurisdiction." The story detailed how the HOA had fined a property it never legally controlled. The article quoted the judge's order and included a photo of the garden. Sunlight on roses, lavender swaying. Nothing dangerous except the truth. Within days, neighboring communities began asking questions of their own associations. People wanted to see deeds, covenants, meeting records. The illusion of infallibility cracked. Inside my own neighborhood, the fallout was swift. 2 board members resigned immediately. The treasurer followed a week later. Barbara held out the longest, insisting she had acted in good faith. When she finally stepped down, the resignation email was short. "I hope this allows the community to heal." The HOA hired a management company to audit its records. That audit revealed what most of us suspected: years of sloppy administration and selective enforcement. Refunds were quietly issued for improper fines. Policies were rewritten in plain language. For the first time, homeowners were invited to review budgets and vote on decisions that actually affected them. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least a version of it. Neighbors who once glared began stopping by to compliment the garden. Some even asked for advice on planting. I showed them what my father taught me: how to cut stems at an angle, how to water in the morning instead of at night, how to let a little wildness live between the order. One afternoon, an elderly couple who'd lived there since the beginning walked over with a photograph of my father taken decades earlier, him standing beside the same trellis that now stood behind me. "He used to help us with our tomatoes," they said. "He hated the HOA before it even started." We laughed, and something in that laughter felt like closure. A few months later, I received the official copy of the court's final judgment. Recorded with the county, it confirmed in legal language what the garden had proven in silence. The HOA had no authority here, not now, not ever. I framed the document and hung it in my father's workshop, above the bench where he used to fix tools. It didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like balance restored. The neighborhood itself began to change. The new board, made up mostly of homeowners who'd once been afraid to speak, focused on transparency. They canceled the nightly security patrols, stopped issuing petty fines, and rewrote the rules to remove unnecessary restrictions. At meetings, people actually talked instead of whispering. The fear that had hung over the place like humidity began to lift. One evening, the new board hosted a community picnic. I went, though I wasn't sure how I'd be received. To my surprise, it was friendly. even warm. People laughed, kids played, and the tension that once defined this place seemed to dissolve. The new president, a soft-spoken man who ran a landscaping business, walked up to me and said, "Your father's garden reminded us what we were supposed to be protecting." After that, I stopped being the man who sued the HOA and became the guy with the garden. That was enough for me. Sometimes, when the sun sets and the garden glows gold, I think about how close I came to losing it. Not just the plants, but the piece of my father that lived in them. Bureaucracy nearly erased a legacy, but it also revealed something my father must have understood all along. That control is only as strong as people's willingness to accept it. The story spread farther than I expected. A year later, a regional homeowners association newsletter referenced the case as an example of jurisdictional boundaries. Lawyers started citing it in similar disputes. Every time I stumbled across it, I felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. My father's stubborn insistence on paperwork had turned into precedent. Visitors sometimes stop by now, people from nearby towns who've read about the case. They ask to see the garden, to take photos. They tell me their own stories about HOAs that find them for bird feeders or flags or mismatched shutters. I listen, I nod, and I tell them the same thing. Get everything in writing and never assume authority is real just because someone says it is. The irony is that the HOA now promotes the garden in their brochures. They call it a historic feature symbolizing individuality and community spirit. The same organization that once called it a nuisance now uses it as decoration. I don't mind. If my father's garden can teach them irony, that's progress. As seasons changed, life settled into rhythm again. Spring brought new blooms. Summer filled the air with bees. Autumn painted the paths in gold. I started keeping the gates open more often so kids could walk through on their way home from school. Some of them would stop and ask questions about the flowers, their curiosity free from the pettiness that once ruled this street. And through it all, I kept thinking about my father, his patience, his stubborn humor, the foresight he had when he wrote that clause decades ago. He probably never imagined it would end up in a courtroom. But he understood something fundamental, that freedom, even in a neighborhood, has to be written down somewhere, or it disappears. Looking back, the whole fight feels both ridiculous and necessary. Ridiculous because it was over a garden. Necessary because small battles are where control either takes root or dies. I used to think strength meant never bending. Now I know it means knowing when to dig in and when to let time do its work. Sometimes, at dusk, I walk the path through the lavender and stop at the trellis. The wood is weathered, the paint flaking, but it stands firm. I run my hand along it and remember the sound of my father hammering it together all those years ago. He used to hum while he worked, some tune with no name. I hum it now without realizing. The house feels lighter these days. No more fear of envelopes or meetings or fines, just space to live. Every once in a while, a new neighbor moves in and asks about the old stories. I tell them gently that there was a time when people here forgot that property lines mean something and that a little color in a yard isn't chaos. It's proof that someone cares. That's the real legacy my father left behind. Not the documents, not even the garden itself, but the reminder that beauty doesn't ask permission. One evening, I found a letter in the mail, not from the HOA, but from a stranger. It was handwritten, shaky script. I read about your case. It said, I used your filings to stop my HOA from cutting down the trees my husband planted before he passed. Thank you for showing that ordinary people can fight back. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my father's workshop beside the framed judgment. I realized then that the fight had grown beyond my fence line. It had become a quiet chain of defiance linking strangers who refused to let rules erase memory. Now, when I water the garden at sunrise, I sometimes think about how absurd it all was, how many sleepless nights, how much paperwork, how much fear for something as simple as flowers. But then I see the sun catch the petals just right, and I understand why it mattered. The garden isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who's ever been told to conform, to trim the edges of their life to fit someone else's pattern. When I finish tending the roses, I sit on the porch with coffee and look at the plaque that started it all. My father's memorial, the one the HOA once called unapproved signage. The metal has dulled a little, but the engraving is still clear. It reads, "Nothing alive ever grows by permission." Those words saved me once. They still do. Because in the end, the HOA only had paper. And we had roots. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time with this story. If it left you thinking about control, legacy, or the little ways power shows up in everyday life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or a rule that went too far? Share your experience in the comments. I read every one. And if you enjoy stories about real people standing up for what matters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Your support helps keep these true, human stories alive. Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest stand can grow into something much bigger.